Hey everyone, welcome back. I got a question in my comments that reads as follows. Can you elaborate a little on the following? The documents in the Trump case, do they belong to the President or the Presidency? While the President can declassify and declare some documents as personal, is there a distinction over ownership between the President and the Presidency? As in, Trump is still a president, but his presidency is over and the authority went with it. So where is the line drawn? And the reason I really liked this question is that it gets at two different things. Number one, some of the technicalities over the ownership of government documents at the end of a presidency, but more importantly, this commenter draws a distinction between the president and the presidency that we often don't actually distinguish when we're talking about the structure of the US government. So, what I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about that distinction between the president and the presidency, and then show how that applies to the Trump documents case. So, what is the difference between the president and the presidency? And the answer is where the actual power lies. If you look through the Constitution and our other founding documents, you'll very quickly see that power is not vested in individuals, but in institutions. And the presidency is just one of those institutions, established in Article 2 of the Constitution. So, all of the powers we normally associate with the president, signing bills into law, appointing judges, declassifying documents, those are actually powers of the presidency. However, an institution is just a bunch of rules on paper. They can't actually do anything on their own, so we have people put in charge of those institutions in order to execute their authority. In the case of the presidency, we elect a president. So, when a president is first sworn into office, they assume the ability to use all of the powers of the presidency for the duration of their term as they see fit, within the scope of their oath of office, and that power ends the second their successor is sworn into office. Then, all of the power of the presidency moves on to the new president, and the old president goes back to being just a regular citizen, with maybe one or two caveats that we'll get to at the very end of the video. With that in mind, let's turn to Donald Trump's current situation and start to draw some of those lines that my commenter was asking about. The big one, of course, is that anything Donald Trump wanted to do had to be done before the end of his term. As the second Joe Biden was sworn into office, he assumed the office of the presidency and therefore received all of its powers and privileges. Meanwhile, Donald Trump became a former president, which basically just makes you a regular citizen. Now, yes, we do still refer to all former presidents as president, but it's really more of a title of respect for the service that they gave to the country during their time in office rather than any official title, as the only person who is officially the president is whoever is the current office holder. Next, let's move on to talk about the line between presidential records and personal records. And the nice thing about this line is that it is very explicitly laid out in the law, specifically the Presidential Records Act. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through the sections of that law that define presidential records and personal records, and I'll put the relevant passages up on screen so you guys can follow along. The term presidential records means documentary material or any reasonably segregable portion thereof created or received by the president's immediate staff, or a unit or individual in the executive office of the president whose functions it is to advise or assist the president in the course of conducting activities which relate to or have an effect upon the carrying out of the constitutional, statutory, or other official or ceremonial duties of the president. Meanwhile, the term personal records means all documentary materials or any reasonable segregable portion thereof of a purely private or non-public character which do not relate to or have any effect upon the carrying out of the constitutional, statutory, or other official or ceremonial duties of the president. Simply put, if a document is in any way, shape, or form work-related, it is a presidential record. On the other hand, if it is purely private, then it's a personal record. The president has no authority to determine what type of record a document might be, as it is very clearly stated within the Presidential Records Act. Then, after the conclusion of the president's term, all of the presidential records remain in the custody of the government. Meanwhile, any personal records can go with the former president. A great example of this from Donald Trump's current predicament is the alleged plan for an attack on Iran that Donald Trump is heard discussing with several reporters on a tape recording. Now, a military attack plan that is drawn up by the Department of Defense for the president in his official capacity as the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Armed Forces is obviously a presidential record and therefore property of the U.S. government. However, some of that information could have been incorporated into a personal record. Let's say that Donald Trump keeps a diary, however unlikely that might be. And one day he writes, "Dear Diary, today General Milley brought me a plan to invade Iran. I thought it was interesting, blah 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 blah." Now that could be a personal record, provided that Donald Trump keeps it private and does not use it in any way, shape, or form in the course of his duties as president, that it is not a direct copy of the original plan, and that it does not contain any classified information that would have been produced for the president in his official capacity by various agencies of the US government. Actually, when you read through the law, it is really, really hard for the president to produce personal documents, as so much of what they do is consumed by their work. Now, when it comes to declassifying information, things are a little bit different because the president is the ultimate declassification authority in the US government. Obviously, a president can only declassify something while they actually are president, and it's also not something that they can just snap their fingers and have happen. Like anything in the government, it's a process. And it usually starts with the president ordering that a piece of information be declassified, and that order is sent to the relevant agency that produced that information. That agency, in turn, briefs the president on any potential impacts that declassification might have on national security. And usually they'll go back and forth for a bit, trying to achieve the intent that the president wants while minimizing the impact to national security. And at the end of the day, the president can then decide whether he does or does not want to declassify something. Then, once it is declassified, the agency will go through, notify anybody involved that, hey, this document's been declassified, and they will also spread that declassification through any other documents that reference the original declassified documents. During that time, they're also probably calling any confidential sources or spies who might be in trouble. Let's say something regarding Russian troop movements. They might say, "Hey, Yuri, you know those troop movements you sent us? Yeah, they were great, but the president's about to declassify them, and the Russians are going to know it was you who sent them. You may want to get out of Russia in the next 10 days, because on day 10, these records are coming out. So, good luck. Bye." Now, we know Donald Trump didn't declassify these documents because, as anyone who's worked with the government knows, where there is process, there is paperwork. And so far, we have seen no documents to show that Donald Trump actually went through the process of declassification. Given that the DOJ had plenty of access to various government agencies and more than likely was part of the declassification authority for some of these documents, they would have known if that paperwork existed. And in Trump's own words, from what's written in the indictment, he knew that after he was done being president, there was nothing he could do to declassify documents. So, 99% sure that these documents are still classified, and Donald Trump is probably in a bit of trouble for having them. Now, I said earlier that there were a few caveats and exceptions where former presidents can tap into the power of their former office, but a lot of those exceptions are based on the current officeholder extending them that privilege. A great example comes from the Presidential Records Act. A former president may notify the National Archivist that, hey, you're about to release some of my records that I would prefer not be released. And then the National Archivist can say, okay, I've heard you. But they still have to consult with the incumbent president, and it's the incumbent president that ultimately makes the decision as to whether those documents are released or not. The same thing comes with executive privilege. Generally speaking, the incumbent president will extend his executive privilege as he holds the office over his predecessors out of a sign of respect of the fact that they had to make decisions the same way that he did, so he's going to protect their privilege as well. But in the same instance, the current president can waive a former president's executive privilege, as at the end of the day, they hold the office, so they hold the privilege. Another perk that you get for being a former president is that most of them do get access to classified briefings on issues of national security. And that's because the current president may want to consult with his predecessors and get their opinions on certain things. You can imagine that being president is very stressful, and there's very few people who are going to be able to understand the situation you're in the same way that a former president can. So, a lot of times former presidents will be kept up to date on classified information so that should the current president want to discuss it with them, they're up to speed and can give the current president good advice. Now, I don't think Trump is getting those briefings because he has obviously shown that he is a threat to national security, and President Biden is not forced to extend that courtesy to him. He might still be extending it to Presidents Obama, Bush, and Clinton, but at the end of the day, that's his prerogative to extend that privilege to the former president. He is not required to in any way, shape, or form. So, even when former presidents are allowed to exercise some of the privileges of their former office, it is always at the discretion of the current president. So, to sum everything up, when it comes to the power of the executive, that power rests with the office of the presidency rather than any individual president. And a former president really has no authority to do anything without the consent of the current president. When it comes to deciding what is a presidential record or a personal record, that line is very clearly drawn by the Presidential Records Act, and the president has no authority to decide which records are which. When it comes to declassification, yes, the president has the authority to declassify things, but they still have to go through the processes and fill out the paperwork. I hope this answered your question, and if anybody else has any other questions regarding this topic or anything else going on, please feel free to leave me a comment. Oh, and if you're thinking of going home with any presidential records or classified information in the near future, I do ask that you take a minute and think about it.